And the title is Emotional Landscapes because that's the beginning of the chorus of yoga that was published as part of Homogenic in 1997. In that song, Björk is talking about mental states, and mental states are created through Icelandic landscape, but in this case, and I think it works for the exhibition because the mental states in this case could be connected with American landscape, that it's a reference that it's very much connected to the classical Thyssen Collection, that it's something that we want to revisit and we want to rethink. Every single piece that we are going to see in the exhibition, it's a mental state in a way. It brings us to a place where we can connect or where we can think about emotions. And I do remember you speaking about emotions and telling me like all these pieces are about emotions. So maybe that should be the beginning of the conversation.
You know, I always kind of connect to all artworks on an emotional level, you know. I cried once in a museum when I saw Manzoni's Merda de Artista. And just realizing the kind of mega emotions of this man's, you know, death at a young age. And, you know, it was a crazy emotional piece for me. So, like, usually when I connect to artworks, it's always about the emotional. And I think everything is, you know, pretty much sculpted out of the emotional. And be it, but then I'm also, like, raised in the theater where emotion, which is like the most manipulative art forms of all art forms, theater and film, where you're like, you have to make people feel this, and that, then you have to make them feel that. Because I've always been like total lover of theater. I really love this kind of emotionality of it, but then I wanted to kind of work with it in a visual art way, which is way more open and hopefully less manipulative in a way that you can always walk in and out of it, and it's just kind of I always think it's important that the emotionality is open and kind of, you know, I don't want to understand it myself, what I should feel or what an audience should feel. It's never like, you know, I want this piece to feel like this. It's just like I want to play with emotions in this piece in that way. It's like, okay, here we're kind of playing with death. And, you know, and then it's, you know, like when you're playing with emotions and it's always just like death and love and death and love, you know.
Friends, there is a lot of honesty when you present the emotions, that's a difference with theater, that you are going through them. So there is a melancholy that it's part, I mean, for example, in The Visitors, it's part of a personal process. So God, I think it's part of a longer performance. So there is a part of being honest and sharing even yourself. When you are presenting a video installation, is part of yourself there, no? Or at least the person you used to be at that moment.
It always needs to be honest, you know. Even, like, you know, sometimes it's been said, you know, that I am kind of all these different characters in these works. I'm never like in a different character, I just wear different clothes for compositional reasons. So I never dive into that character or this character. It's just like, I'm here in a tuxedo with a lot of pink satin, singing about sorrow, or I am, you know, in the Rocky Mountains with David, drunk on whiskey, you know, kind of contemplating hell.
And does it come from a personal need? It comes from a reading? It comes from a song? No, because they're like music, it's also traversing all those pieces, and it's a very important reference.
The pieces usually just start as an idea. Something very kind of, it's like, you know, at the end of the day, I'm just a conceptual artist, you know. But then you kind of, it's like, it's always the idea. What you are like, that's like what kicks in. This would be interesting. This is an interesting context situation. Like then you just go for that, and in that is born this reality and these these emotions you work with. And
But you play with that.
yeah, to play with that.
And for example, in the case of the pieces that are in the exhibition, they all connect with this idea of North America and, as I said before, with the American landscape. And there is a very strong fascination on your practice, on your life with that. Would you?
Yeah, it's like you're kind of, I mean, I'm, raised in Iceland during the Cold War when it's like, America and the Soviets and like constant tension. And you got, and like I was, my parents were, they were kind of, cozy socialists. They were not like militant. They didn't do anything bad, but so there was like I was raised in a lot of kind of anti-Americanism, but of course like and always had this kind of like I always like I remember being a kid like American things are disgusting. Yes, American. I think they were not telling me that. It's just when you're a kid you just like sometimes exaggerate one little comment made, and I think that fascination of like this kind of forbidden fruit of America became more and more fascinating for me, and also like for me like through my career like since it started out I've just been playing very much with this idea of Western culture, being it American or European, or it's like you would almost call it like because like in Iceland we've been striving to be a part of it, and so it's like it's kind of playing with the culture of superpowers. It's not my culture, but I love to play with it, and when it's superpowers, it's totally fine to play with it.
And what brought you to here? This is one of the images of the end. That's the Rocky Mountains.
Yeah, I think like the idea for the piece came from a Supertramp record, actually. Do you remember that cover? Yeah. It's like a piano in the snow. Yeah, even in the quietest moments. So I just always thought that was like kind of, a bit kind of outrageous cover. It's kind of you look at that cover and you realize like okay, yeah, people had to make punk rock. So that was this. I mean, this thing of playing with that kind of iconic images of like American landscape and kind of pop music, and be playing this rock and roll music in that landscape. It just somehow it also came to me just like after visiting Banff. Sometimes pieces are just like born like I really want to do something in that spot, and to also like it was also a part of the the piece was specially made for the when I did the Icelandic Pavilion in Venice in 2009, and then it was a play like I am representing Iceland, the land of volcanoes where the lava meets the sea, etc., emotional landscape. And it was sort of a play also just to use another landscape. I hardly it's just recently I've started to use like the landscape of or the culture of my own country. I just love to play with the superpowers.
So then you go with David Thor. That's one of your longest time collaborators.
Yes, we've collaborated for many years, and we just went there to try to create this multi-screen installation in the snow, and we were so lucky that it was very, and working with the technical crew there at Banff, it was many people were really scratching their heads how we could do it. Like the technology really kind of wasn't there back then. Super easy now, but we were so lucky to me and David to meet really cool intern there called Chris McDonald, who is here, and and Chris, we've worked together ever since. So Chris came with solutions to do this, to manage to like sync us playing with each other like outside, and and then continuing to make these kind of technological feats which they are around these pieces, but the ideas are never technological. It's like it takes a lot of brain power to actually make it happen, and Chris has been very elemental in that.
At some point, I think you mentioned it was because you were there with minus 35 degrees, so it was like really, really tough. That it was like a climbing performance, no? Like kind of suffering through 5 days, and this brings also the idea of time and repetition that you've mentioned before with theater, but that it's the pieces we see, they are the result of long recordings or long times at least in these spaces.
Yeah, to create this kind of like, like I always like the idea of heroic in performance art, which kind of comes from Martin Abramovich. It's like, and I like it, then I also kind of like to deconstruct it in a way that it isn't really. I mean, it's like it was a lot of fun just to be out in the cold and play. It wasn't that terrible. I mean, there are much more hard things people do, and like reality is more hard than being in the Rocky Mountains playing music.
Taking about tough realities, I think that it's also important to speak about the place, no? That we have pointed it out, speaking about American landscape and all the contradictions it involves in terms of this idea of the Wild West, of the last bit of the world to be colonized, when there was already existing inhabitants. There were like first people, there were people that were living there, and that we were discussing like even the naming, no? And how it is important that those hidden stories also, not hidden, like being left aside, because there are like many stories that haven't been told because out of the interest of those powers we were referring to. Yeah. And that's also important in these pieces.
Yeah, I mean, the piece is more like playing with the ultimate Western cliche. And, I really like frozen Westerns, like Jeremiah Johnson, like Westerns that take place in, where everything is super cold and frozen. And they shoot a lot of these Westerns up there in Alberta. So it was a lot of, this one, as in most of my pieces, they're all very inspired by the obvious. So the cliche is something I really like.
Because, sometimes they help us to look to the things, no, from a perspective, and gives us the idea of facing those situations.
Yeah, and there is always such truth in a cliche. There is like truth and oppression and violence and whatnot. Like, why are friends like friends? Why is like to watch the TV series Friends and realize it's like crazy. It's just like, tells us how to behave, etc. That was not the intention, but things, that the kind of the obvious things are so brutal in many ways.
And another piece of the exhibition, and this is quite unique because it's one of the pieces that you don't appear there, is the man.
Yeah.
And it brings, and to me it's really important because this piece brings a character, Pinetop Perkins, to the front and makes an homage to those people that maybe he belongs to the books, but maybe there is a lot to his character. So
yeah, it was also like, for me, it was like, Pinetop Perkins, who is the man.
The man.
And that he is of this, because it's like a lot of dealing with the American, and he is, he represents American culture. He is a part of the gang of the Delta bluesmen that actually just created the thing that is American culture, which is like the music. We got some Herman Melville and Jackson Pollock, but it's the music that is American culture. And because he played with Muddy Waters, he knew Robert Johnson. He was discovered by Sonny Boy Williamson, and was born in 1911 and raised just raised on a plantation, and like he made me feel his head. That like he was beaten so much up with clubs as a kid on the plant, that they would like dents in his head, and so it was really this kind of closeness with this brutal history. But he represents the big time represents the emancipation and kind of the cultural victory of Black Americans, and that created the first global culture. Like this gang of bluesmen created the blues, and then that became rock and roll, and that became, whatever, all the things that are in our radios and telephones constantly. So it's just this amazing thing to get to know somebody who created like such a big chunk of Western culture. It was almost like, he was a man in the background. He wasn't Muddy Waters or Robert Johnson. It was sort of like it's getting to know somebody who was hanging out with Sappho and Homer and kind of working on stuff with Sappho and Homer. And that was one of these kind of crazy experiences in art, to be with him for a week and then recording him. Because I saw him play live in Iceland because one of his best friends is an Icelandic musician. And so he played at a blues festival where David Thor was playing with him. And Pinetop, being 97 years old, he would just do a song, and then he would just repeat the song again and say the same kind of old kind of bluesman phrases. And I just found it so interesting that like he was in his old age, he just had become this, the blues act was just him, like always wearing sharp clothes and saying all right. And when you heard Pinetop saying all right, it's like the original all right. It's like kind of get goosebumps when I first heard him say all right. Yeah, here he is. So you'll see him in the piece there, because I just asked him to, like, we transported his piano out into a field close by his home, and his piano was given to him by B.B. King, actually. So on his 88th birthday, it's like 88 keys for 88 years. So it was, it was a really kind of happy experience to be able to document him in this state of mind of kind of constantly being in the blues, being in show business, which he was. Like, you would go to his home, and he was just always by the piano, just singing those same songs again and again, and then like doing like, oh, the piano is out of tune, oh. And he would just always say that, if it was an electric piano or anything. It's just like, it's kind of these show business phrases that he was just like, would just repeat.
And this is also a reference to American painting, because the landscape is very similar to, it's a reference to Andrew White's Christina's Wall. And I think it's really interesting to see his figure, because Christina's is a blonde girl lying on the grass, and we have a black person here.
Yeah. And
I think that's a very interesting change, and also it changes completely the rhythm.
Yeah, it was just, for me, it was again this like, it was this like, I really want to do a video with Pinetop. How should I do it? And then it was just like, we went to Texas, and then it was like, okay, we should just shot it somewhere outside. And then I always had this kind of in my head, like I wanted to find a place which kind of looked like Christina's world. Because like outside Austin, there's like a lot of these fields with these kind of derelict houses. And I loved it when he saw the video. He was just like, "Pooh, this house needs some fixing up." Yeah. So that was also like another American cliche I wanted to work out. Because also what was interesting, like he is the guy who created the cliche of the bluesman. He's of that gang, and he had become that cliche. And but he isn't the cliche. It was like all this like tick, 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 tick. Everything in contradiction.
And everything together, piling up.
Yeah.
And also, there is continuous reference to painting in your works. And it's seen throughout the exhibition, no? And also when we have walked around the collection, you've been always mentioning those artists that you would like to, I mean, being close to Yves Tanguy or like those references that are important. Because you were formed, I mean, you were at the university studying painting.
Yeah, I studied painting and I wanted to become a painter, and I look at these video, it's just like, the video works out. I think it's very inspired, I think, by like Carolee Schneemann, who was always about like making the film and photograph a medium of painting. And Carolee was always talking about that she was a painter first and foremost. And I sort of like that attitude. So I'm very basic. I always look at like my video works as paintings and the performances as sculpture.
And they combine together on a huge installation, no? Immersive installations. Because this could be asked to the visitors that it's the main piece in the exhibition. I wouldn't say any of them it's the main piece, but it's true that the visitors is one of the most acknowledged piece, which is...
Yeah, the visitors is a piece which is on 9 screens of friends from the Reykjavik music scene. And we are just kind of playing music in this old house called Rokeby Farm in upstate New York. And that also came from, like, I was staying at Rokeby Farm when I was working on a project in Bard, and just being there with Ricky and Anya, who live there, who were this fantastic king and queen of Bohemia. They're just, they're not just some fancy people upstate New York who kind of have some art events. They're just like, they're like crazy Bohemian. They like, it's like witchcraft and because they're descendants of the Astors, so they have the place, but they're not in any business, or they're just kind of living there, and the living of tenants of the land who shoot deer, so they always eat deer stew. And I just lived with them for 2 weeks before, a few years before that, and I was just like, I want to do something in this house. It's just crazy, beautiful. And then the idea was just to like have friends come and live it with me and do this piece. And this piece is really made after doing the end, Rocky Mountains. Sort of the same idea of having each screen like a sled on the mixer table, which you can mix yourself with walking through the installation.
Another thing that there is here in the visitors is a sense of community, and that's very important. No? When we spoke about the piece, like the fact that you were together for 1 week, this is the last day, and it's what is being recorded and what is being presented in the space is the last moment of a process of being together and sharing time together.
It's really kind of, and this piece, and a lot of the pieces are about community and having kind of lived experiences together. I think that's really important for my practice. This like just doing stuff together, and this was basically that.
And it's something that, I mean, this piece that was very much connected with the end. Now I think with the time it has add new layers, no? Like some pieces that traverse time and temporalities. And we were talking before, like how much this piece being seen after the pandemic, it becomes also an homage to togetherness, no? To this idea of, as you said, being together, and how relevant it became. Most of the people, and many of the people that have seen it these days while the installation, they were like almost crying because of the fact of being all these characters living together and walking together while singing and creating a group of people. And that's really beautiful, no? How time adds layers to the pieces and how they are gaining with...
Yeah, that's always fun to watch when pieces like get a new meaning. And it's fun to see that happen with your own works. And but there was also funny, like there was like, I mean, remember, like there was like one of the last concerts of the Rolling Stones with Charlie Watts was like they were on Zoom in different mansions, and somebody said like, "Oh, the Rolling Stones must have been inspired by the visitors," But it's just like the Rolling Stones all lived in fancy mansions. So it looked like the visitors.
Maybe a last mention to one of the other pieces, but God, that's also a reference to American culture.
Yeah.
And sorrow conquers happiness. I mean, it's like...
Yeah, it's just this phrase, sorrow conquers happiness, repeated again and again. And I remember that phrase came about when I was with my band called Trabant. We were playing live, and there was just like a club in Reykjavik, and suddenly I started screaming like, sorrow conquers happiness, sorrow conquers happiness. And it was just such a moment. And so then I really wanted to do something with that sentence. And then Davíð Þór and Helgi Svavar and Valdi of the band Felice were having a concert and asked me to perform with them. And then for that concert we wrote the music to Sorrow Conquers Happiness. And that was something I was really intrigued by, and we recorded a video of it. But then I had this longing, I wanted to create a video which kind of felt like these kind of 1950s, 60s Hollywood song and dance, things that just like feel like glazed sugar and heroin. So me and Nina from the Living Art Museum, we approached Francesca and Daniela about this idea of supporting to create this piece where we would hire a studio and make a kind of a song and dance production, full on. But it's done with also it's also this kind of community thing. It's the jazz trio Fleece, and then the string players are my aunt Bryndís, who plays in the Icelandic Symphony Orchestra, and she was just got some friends with her. Yeah, the name God for that piece, Sorrow Conquers Happiness. I remember just doing that piece, and I was like, should it be called Sorrow Conquers Happiness? It's and then you go and see the piece, it's just Sorrow Conquers Happiness. It just needed something. And I remember just, what is the most outrageous title? And then that was just God. But also in a way, I think I was at the time I was really, remember that REM song, Losing My Religion? It was at the time, because I was very religious as a kid and, into my 20s. So it was at the time when I was really losing my religion. So I think it's also kind of connected to that. But that piece was really kind of a start. I had made video art before, but that was really it was something really kind of clicked that I wanted to continue with making that piece. So I'm very helpful and very thankful for that collaboration of being able to create it.
So I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, I was thinking two different things, because it's very interesting how we both use the idea of the performance. But I'm wondering, because sometimes when I'm editing stuff, it's I call her a she, my voice, it's a removed thing. How do you feel about when you're doing the editing and stuff like that, or even, the first rushes or something like that, or even designing a piece? Do you see yourself as a character?
No, I don't see myself as a character. I just use myself when I kind of want to use that element in a work. It's because it's the element of the artist performing. And sometimes you kind of need that for a work, because then it has that kind of self-portrait twist to it.
But I find it interesting, the mediation, what happens to the personality of the artist once you have it go through mediation.
It is really interesting, because there is something, and also it's always dangerous, it always feels weirdly egocentrical. And that's also something I kind of find funny to work with in a way. This megalomania ideas, and but also but when you're doing it, but when you are there's a weird thing. What often happens with film, contrary to live performance, is that film often becomes much more intimate. That like there is like in the live performance, like I also sense it as an audience. You're always just like, you know, you don't want that fourth. You're scared of that fourth wall being broken, etc. But you can totally trust a moving image. It's not going to do anything to you. So that's like there is like this kind of relaxed attitude you have to it, but at the same time, the performative energy, there's nothing freaking like it. But
I think you're right. I think it has something to do with also the technology has a way of, people are so used to using their iPhone or listening to speakers or to seeing films and stuff like that. And so you sort of create this invisible fourth wall, and so that you are, so it creates more of an intimacy. I think you're right about that.
yeah.
I've always wondered, and I want your opinion on it. What is it that evolutionary-wise that we need music for? I mean, why do we, you know, if you're depressed or something, you go put on your favorite album, you walk around with your AirPods on, and then your mood changes. What is about music that is so important to us, that you are tapping into?
It's just like this. I always think that like, I always like the description that Franz Schubert, the 18-year-old poet, did with his 18-year-old friend Schubert when they wrote to Musik, an die Musik. It's like your noble art in all these gray moments when the will of life is like seeping out of me. You freaking save me. And it's just like, it's always, music always taps into that. It's just, what happened in evolution that we got this tool, and now we're like using it so much, so insanely much. And I was raised also by a musician who just hated the idea of recorded music. She was like born in 1900, and she just was appalled by the idea that people were listening to music without sitting and seeing it being performed to them. So I was really happy to have that portal, to know someone whose idea of music was so different to ours. But yeah, I couldn't. It's just like I'm a total sucker for music, whatever music there is. It just always makes me kind of happy.
Yeah, it's the same thing of evolutionary-wise about beauty too, right? Because why do we seek it? And you use both beauty and the music. Yeah.
I mean, but also the interesting thing, music is a more innocent thing than beauty. I mean, beauty is like, you know, it's crazy oppressive and crazy dangerous. Just like Nazis really liked beauty. So that's also why what I find interesting with beauty is like when you deal with it in kind of post-20th century, you know, when you're dealing with beauty in the 20th century, you're dealing with something very problematic. And it's very different from when you were like a romantic artist. So, but also like, but music is always this kind of beauty portal. And then it's ridiculous how simple it always has to become a beauty portal.
I'm curious, because actually so much of your work is shot and filmed outside of Iceland. But you were talking the other day about how important being in your country is. You have a farmhouse that is quite remote as well, with your family, and your relationship to nature and so on. And Iceland has just got the most incredible landscape. And why have you not really done, or maybe I don't know of a piece that you've shot in Iceland and, you know, making that a very Icelandic piece? Is there a reason?
Yeah, it's just, you know, it's like, I mean, when you live, because like Iceland, you know, it's really like, you know, if you were like Spanish and living in Mallorca, it's like you live in a cliche. And like when you live in Iceland, you feel you live in people's expectations of that place. And so I haven't really used it much, but I'm totally attached to it and all its stories. And also maybe it's not like a truthful answer. Maybe it's more like I just, I find, maybe because I know Iceland too well, I just find it interesting to work with something I don't really know. And I think that is in many ways like a kind of like a Dieter Roth influence. Like also like my favorite artists who deal with Iceland, like like Dieter Roth and Ronnie Horn, are not Icelandic. So like in a way, with working with Iceland, I'm always feel like I am like stepping on Ronnie Horn's turf.
So in fact, the Palace in the Summerland, the piece that we produced with you in Vienna, in Augarten, that was really the closest you came to sort of really Icelandic culture, landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. That was just dealing with that whole thing, the World Light and the Palace of the Summerland. And then afterwards, I did a piece called Sumarnótt, which is also done in Iceland. But there I have come to terms with it.
Just because you mentioned the concept of endurance right there, and there are various performance artists that work with endurance, but I'm wondering how do you think it functions in terms of like the over and over and over, and why do you use it first, and then what effect do you think it has on the audience?
Yeah, like I started using endurance performance because I just loved that you could just stay in a situation. It didn't need to get narrative because I really loved performing, but like the problem with performing, be it music or theater, is like it always has to be narrative. But like endurance performance, you just can just stay in this situation. And what I think it does for an audience is that you start to look at something performative, looking at it the same way you look at you look at a painting or sculpture. That you take away with this expectation of, okay, what happens next? It's just like you just contemplate this moment. This is what's being presented to you without awaiting results.
And is there a connection to certain minimalist composers like Philip Glass or something like that, in terms of how that functions with endurance?
It was much more, the kind of the hardcore performance artists, like like Marina Abramovic and Chris Burton, and this kind of creating a moment again and again and again, But more than Philip Glass, I think John Cage is, definitely an influence. And more like John Cage is such an influencer, he's such a kind of art philosopher that like, this idea of, like repeat something, what did he say? Like repeat something, 3 times it's uninteresting, repeat something 5 times it's uninteresting, repeat something 100 times it's interesting.